Marcus Thompson stared at the acceptance letter from the Galactic Exchange Program, his hands trembling slightly as he read the official seal of the Intergalactic Council. At 28, he had been working as a military engineer for the past 6 years, designing defense systems that protected Earth's outer colonies. His colleagues at the Terran Defense Initiative thought he was crazy for applying to the program, but Marcus had always been driven by an insatiable curiosity about the universe beyond their solar system. The program promised cultural exchange with the Zephyrian Empire, a technologically advanced civilization that had recently made contact with humanity. Earth's government was eager to establish diplomatic relations, especially after the Zephyrians demonstrated their superior technology by effortlessly neutralizing several asteroid threats that had been heading toward populated worlds. The exchange program was presented as an honor, a chance for selected humans to learn from one of the galaxy's most sophisticated species. What the recruitment materials didn't mention, and what Marcus would only discover after arriving on Zephyr Prime, was that the cultural exchange was actually a barely concealed trial by ordeal. The Zephyrians, despite their advanced technology, maintained ancient traditions that viewed other species as inherently inferior until proven otherwise. Every exchange participant was subjected to what they called the Crucible of Worth, a series of increasingly dangerous challenges designed to test not just physical capability, but mental resilience, moral character, and the ability to adapt under extreme pressure. Marcus learned this harsh truth from Dr. Elena Vasquez, the program coordinator who met him at the orbital station above Zephyr Prime. Elena had been working with the Zephyrians for 3 years, and the weight of her experiences showed in the lines around her eyes and the careful way she chose her words. As their shuttle descended through the planet's iridescent atmosphere, she explained what really awaited him. "The Zephyrians don't see this as cruelty," Elena said, her voice barely audible over the shuttle's engines. "In their culture, proving one's worth through adversity is the highest form of respect they can show a potential ally. The problem is, their definition of survivable adversity is calibrated to their own physiology and psychology, not ours." The statistics were grim. Of the 47 humans who had participated in the program over the past 3 years, only 12 had completed all phases of the trial. Of those 12, 8 had suffered permanent physical or psychological damage. The others had returned to Earth forever changed, some unable to readjust to normal life. 3 participants had died during the trials, though the Zephyrians insisted these were accidents rather than failures of the system. Marcus felt his stomach drop as Elena continued. "The Zephyrians genuinely believe they're honoring us by not making exceptions for our limitations. They see accommodation as condescension. In their minds, if we're truly worthy of partnership, we should be able to meet their standards without modification." The shuttle landed at the Zephyrian capital, a sprawling metropolis of crystalline towers that seemed to grow from the planet's surface like frozen music. The architecture was beautiful but alien, with geometries that made human eyes ache if stared at too long. Marcus was escorted to his quarters in what the Zephyrians called the Preparation Sanctuary, a luxurious but isolated facility where trial participants spent their final days before the crucible began. His quarters were comfortable but sterile, furnished with items that approximated human needs while maintaining distinctly Zephyrian aesthetics. The bed was too firm. The lighting had an odd blue tint that made it difficult to sleep, and the food dispensers provided nutritionally complete meals that tasted like elaborate cardboard. More unsettling was the constant, subtle vibration that ran through the building's structure, a harmonic frequency that the Zephyrians found soothing, but that made Marcus feel vaguely nauseous. During his 3 days of preparation, Marcus was allowed to study recordings of previous trials, though many sections were redacted for what his handler called cultural sensitivity reasons. What he could see was disturbing enough. The trials were divided into 5 phases, each designed to test different aspects of capability and character. Physical challenges that pushed participants beyond their limits, psychological puzzles that seemed designed to break down mental defenses, moral dilemmas with no clear right answers, tests of leadership under impossible circumstances, and finally, something called the integration protocol that the recordings never showed clearly. Marcus watched Thomas Hendricks, a former Navy SEAL, break down completely during the 3rd phase after being forced to choose between saving simulated civilians or completing his mission objective. The psychological stress of the scenario, combined with days of sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion, had shattered the man's legendary composure. Rebecca Martinez, a brilliant physicist, had excelled at the mental challenges but suffered a severe injury during the physical trials when the Zephyrian equipment malfunctioned, crushing her left arm and ending her participation. The pattern was clear. The trials were designed for beings who were physically more resilient, psychologically more adaptable, and operating within a cultural context that prepared them for such ordeals from childhood. Humans were attempting challenges meant for a species that had evolved under different pressures, with different capabilities, and with a fundamentally different relationship to concepts like honor, suffering, and achievement. On his final night before the trials began, Marcus was visited by Zephyrian Overseer Kethler, the official responsible for administering the crucible. Kethler was tall even by Zephyrian standards, with the characteristic pale blue skin and multiple eyes that seemed to see everything simultaneously. His presence filled the room with an aura of ancient authority that made Marcus feel like a child being evaluated by a strict teacher. Human Marcus Thompson. Kethler's voice resonated with harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Tomorrow you begin the path that will determine whether your species deserves our partnership or merely our tolerance. I have observed your preparation, and I find your dedication adequate, though your physical limitations are concerning. Marcus forced himself to meet the alien's gaze, knowing that showing weakness now would color everything that followed. I understand the risks, Overseer. I'm prepared to face whatever challenges you set before me. Kethler's expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested either approval or amusement. Preparation is a luxury your species seems to value highly. We prefer adaptation. Tomorrow, you will discover whether humans can truly adapt, or whether you merely believe you can. As the overseer left, Marcus spent the night staring at the alien constellations visible through his window, knowing that by this time tomorrow, he would either be dead, broken, or facing challenges that no human had ever successfully completed. The weight of representing not just himself, but his entire species, pressed down on him like a physical force. Every human who had failed in the trials hadn't just failed themselves. They had provided evidence for the Zephyrian belief that humanity was inherently inferior. The irony wasn't lost on him that, in seeking to prove human worth, the exchange program had instead been systematically demonstrating human limitations. Each failure reinforced Zephyrian assumptions about human weakness. Each injury proved their lack of resilience. Each psychological breakdown confirmed their mental fragility. Marcus was walking into a system designed to validate prejudices rather than challenge them, and he was determined to be the exception that forced the Zephyrians to reconsider their conclusions. The morning of the first trial arrived with Zephyr Prime's 3 suns casting long shadows across the crystalline cityscape. Marcus ate his final meal in the preparation sanctuary, a flavorless protein paste that would supposedly sustain him through the initial challenges. His hands were steady as he dressed in the form-fitting suit provided by his hosts, a garment that would monitor his vital signs and provide basic protection while ensuring that the trials remained as challenging as intended. Dr. Vasquez arrived to escort him to the trial complex, her expression carefully neutral. As they walked through corridors lined with holographic displays showing previous successful Zephyrian participants, she offered final words of advice that felt more like a benediction than practical guidance. Remember, Marcus, they're not trying to kill you. They genuinely want you to succeed, but only if you can do it on their terms. Don't fight the system. Don't try to find shortcuts, and don't let them see you break. Whatever happens in there, you're representing every human who comes after you. The trial complex was a massive structure that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human perception couldn't quite grasp. As they approached the entrance, Marcus could feel the building's energy signature pressing against his mind, a constant reminder that he was about to enter a realm where human limitations would be tested against alien expectations. The doors opened with a sound like singing crystal, and Marcus stepped forward into whatever waited beyond, carrying the hopes and fears of his entire species on his shoulders. The first phase of the crucible began in what the Zephyrians termed the Foundation Chamber, a vast space that seemed to reshape itself based on the observer's expectations and fears. Marcus found himself standing on a platform suspended over an abyss that stretched beyond sight, with only a narrow bridge of crystalline material connecting him to the far platform, where a pulsing light indicated his destination. The challenge seemed straightforward until Marcus took his first step and realized that the bridge responded to his emotional state. Confidence made the material solid and reliable, but doubt or fear caused it to become translucent and unstable. The Zephyrians had designed a test that made success dependent on maintaining perfect psychological control while navigating a genuinely dangerous obstacle. Marcus had watched recordings of previous participants struggling with this challenge. Amanda Foster, a former Olympic gymnast, had frozen halfway across when her natural caution conflicted with the bridge's requirements for absolute confidence. David Kim, a test pilot accustomed to dangerous situations, had moved too quickly and discovered that overconfidence was as destabilizing as fear. The bridge demanded a precise balance of determination and humility that few humans had managed to achieve. As Marcus began his crossing, he forced himself to focus not on the abyss below, but on his breathing and the steady rhythm of his steps. He had learned meditation techniques during his military training, and now he drew on those skills to maintain the mental state the bridge required. Each step forward was an act of controlled faith, acknowledging the danger while refusing to be paralyzed by it. Halfway across, the bridge began to shift and undulate, responding to some change in the chamber's energy patterns. Marcus felt his confidence waver as the surface beneath his feet became less stable, and he watched the crystalline material begin to fade toward transparency. The Zephyrians were testing his ability to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining psychological equilibrium. Marcus stopped walking and closed his eyes, drawing on techniques he had learned for dealing with equipment failures during dangerous missions. Instead of fighting the bridge's instability, he tried to understand it. The undulating motion had a rhythm, and the fatting seemed to respond to specific types of thoughts and emotions. Fear weakened it, anger made it brittle, but calm acceptance seemed to restore its strength. Opening his eyes, Marcus resumed walking, timing his steps to match the bridge's natural rhythm rather than imposing his own pace. The crystalline surface solidified beneath his feet as he found the proper synchronization between his mental state and the bridge's requirements. The crossing became a meditation in motion, each step a conscious choice to trust in his ability to adapt and overcome. When he reached the far platform, Marcus turned to look back at the bridge he had traversed. It had returned to its original solid state, as if his successful crossing had reset it for the next challenger. A Zephyrian voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in the harmonic tones that served as their formal language before translating to accented English. Phase 1 completed with acceptable efficiency. Participant demonstrates adequate psychological control and adaptive capability. Proceeding to Phase 2 in 37 minutes. Use this time for recovery and preparation. Marcus found himself in a smaller chamber equipped with basic amenities and a viewing screen that showed statistics from his bridge crossing. His heart rate had remained remarkably stable throughout the challenge, and his stress hormones had peaked early before declining to manageable levels. The data suggested that he had found genuine equilibrium rather than simply forcing himself through the trial, a distinction that apparently mattered to his evaluators. The 37-minute rest period felt both too long and too short. Marcus used the time to hydrate, perform basic stretching exercises, and review what he had learned about the subsequent phases. Phase 2 was called the Labyrinth of Necessity, and previous participants had described it as a complex navigation challenge that tested problem-solving skills under pressure. When the rest period ended, Marcus was transported to a new section of the trial complex through what felt like controlled teleportation. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like being dissolved and reconstituted, but he forced himself to accept it as simply another aspect of Zephyrian technology that he needed to adapt to rather than understand. The labyrinth of necessity was indeed a maze, but not the simple physical puzzle that Marcus had expected. The walls were made of the same responsive crystal as the bridge, and they shifted configuration based on his decisions and emotional responses. Dead ends could become passages if approached with the right mindset, while apparently clear paths might become blocked if he moved with too much haste or confidence. More challenging than the shifting walls were the scenarios the labyrinth presented. At various points, Marcus encountered holographic simulations of crisis situations that demanded immediate decisions. A burning building with trapped civilians, a damaged spacecraft with limited life support, a medical emergency with insufficient resources. Each scenario had multiple possible solutions, but the labyrinth seemed to evaluate not just the effectiveness of his choices, but the reasoning behind them and the emotional cost of making them. Marcus realized that the Zephyrians were testing his moral reasoning as much as his problem-solving ability. The labyrinth was designed to present no-win situations and evaluate how he handled the psychological stress of imperfect choices. When faced with the burning building scenario, Marcus chose to prioritize evacuating the largest number of people, even though it meant leaving behind a small child who was trapped in a harder-to-reach location. The decision was tactically sound but emotionally devastating, and the labyrinth's walls shifted to reflect the psychological impact of his choice. The pattern continued through multiple scenarios, each one designed to force difficult decisions under time pressure. Marcus began to understand that the Zephyrians valued leaders who could make necessary choices without being paralyzed by their emotional consequences, but who also didn't become callous to the human cost of their decisions. The labyrinth was measuring his ability to bear the weight of command while maintaining his essential humanity. After what felt like hours but was probably much less time, Marcus emerged from the labyrinth into another preparation chamber. He was physically exhausted and emotionally drained from the constant decision-making and moral evaluation. The viewing screen showed that he had completed Phase 2 faster than any previous human participant, but more importantly, his psychological profile had remained stable throughout the challenge. Dr. Vasquez appeared on a communication screen, her image transmitted from the observation facility where she monitored all trial participants. Her expression was carefully controlled, but Marcus could see approval in her eyes. "You're doing something different than the others, Marcus. I can't quite identify what it is from the monitoring data, but your adaptation patterns are unique. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Phase 3 is where most participants encounter their breaking point." The screen went dark, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that he was succeeding where others had failed not because he was stronger or smarter, but because he was approaching the trials differently. Instead of fighting against the Zephyrian systems, he was learning to work with them. Instead of imposing human solutions on alien problems, he was adapting his thinking to match the requirements of each challenge. Phase 3 began 6 hours later, after a rest period during which Marcus was provided with another flavorless meal and an opportunity to sleep in a meditation pod designed to accelerate physical recovery. The pod's interior was filled with the same harmonic frequencies that permeated Zephyrian architecture, and Marcus found that instead of fighting the alien sensation, accepting it actually helped him achieve deeper rest than normal sleep would have provided. The third phase was called the Crucible of Leadership, and it immediately presented Marcus with his most complex challenge yet. He found himself in command of a mixed team of holographic humans and actual Zephyrian volunteers, facing a crisis scenario that required coordinating between species with completely different capabilities, communication styles, and cultural expectations. The scenario involved a space station emergency where multiple systems were failing simultaneously. Life support was compromised, and evacuation was only partially possible. Marcus had to assign tasks to team members based on their abilities, while managing the cultural friction between human and Zephyrian approaches to crisis management. The humans wanted detailed plans and clear chains of command, while the Zephyrians preferred intuitive coordination and adaptive responses. What made the challenge particularly difficult was that the Zephyrian team members were genuine volunteers who had agreed to participate in the trial, not simulations. Their responses were real, their cultural biases were authentic, and their evaluation of Marcus's leadership would directly influence his final assessment. He was essentially being tested on his ability to command beings who viewed him as inherently inferior, unless he could prove otherwise through his actions. Marcus drew on every leadership technique he had learned during his military career, but quickly realized that conventional human leadership styles were ineffective with the Zephyrians. They responded poorly to direct orders, but worked efficiently when given objectives, and allowed to determine their own methods. They valued consensus building, but became impatient with lengthy discussions. Most importantly, they respected leaders who demonstrated competence through action rather than authority through position. The breakthrough came when Marcus stopped trying to lead the mixed team as a single unit and instead began coordinating two parallel efforts that complemented each other's strengths. He assigned the humans to tasks that required systematic analysis and procedure following, while giving the Zephyrians objectives that benefited from their superior intuitive problem-solving and adaptive capabilities. Rather than forcing integration, he created synergy. The approach worked. The team successfully resolved the crisis scenario in record time, and the Zephyrian volunteers expressed something that Marcus interpreted as surprised approval. Their post-exercise evaluation, conducted in their own language but translated for his benefit, indicated that he had demonstrated adequate understanding of cooperative efficiency and acceptable adaptation to multi-species coordination requirements. More importantly, Marcus felt that he had genuinely learned something valuable about leadership in diverse environments. The trial had forced him to expand his understanding of effective command beyond human-centric models, and the skills he was developing would be valuable regardless of whether he completed the remaining phases. Phases 4 and 5 lay ahead, and Marcus knew from the recordings that these were where the trials became truly dangerous. Phase 4 was called the Test of Sacrifice, and it reportedly involved scenarios where participants had to choose between personal survival and abstract principles. Phase 5, the integration protocol, remained largely mysterious, but the few participants who had completed it described it as fundamentally life-changing in ways they struggled to articulate. As Marcus entered the final rest period before Phase 4, he reflected on how much he had already changed during the trials. He was thinking differently, responding to challenges with approaches that combined human ingenuity with Zephyrian adaptability. The trials were designed to test whether humans could meet alien standards, but Marcus was discovering that the real test was whether he could transcend the limitations of purely human perspectives while retaining what made him essentially human. The question that remained was whether this transformation would be enough to survive what awaited him in the final phases, and whether success would leave him capable of returning to the purely human world he had left behind. Phase 4 began at what Marcus estimated was dawn on Zephyr Prime, though the complex's interior never showed natural light. He had slept fitfully despite the meditation pod's restorative properties, his mind churning through possible scenarios for the trial of sacrifice. The previous recordings had been heavily redacted, showing only fragments of participants facing decisions that clearly carried enormous personal cost. The phase opened in a chamber that was smaller and more intimate than the previous trial spaces, with walls that seemed to pulse with a living heartbeat. Marcus found himself seated across from Overseer Kethler, who materialized from the crystalline walls like a figure emerging from deep water. Between them was a device that resembled a three-dimensional chess board, but with pieces that shifted form and position according to rules Marcus couldn't immediately comprehend. Human Marcus Thompson, Kethler's harmonic voice carried what might have been respect. You have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our initial projections for your species. This phase will determine whether those capabilities extend to the most fundamental requirement of true leadership, the willingness to sacrifice personal desires for greater necessities. The device between them activated, projecting a holographic scenario that surrounded Marcus with complete sensory immersion. He found himself back on Earth, standing in the command center of the Terran Defense Initiative, where he had worked before joining the exchange program. But this was Earth several years in the future, and humanity was facing an invasion by a hostile alien species that had overwhelmed the outer colonies. The scenario was disturbingly realistic, populated by holographic versions of his former colleagues and friends who behaved exactly as Marcus remembered them. Director Patricia Hawkins was coordinating the defense effort with the same methodical intensity she brought to every crisis. Engineer Robert Chen was working frantically on defensive systems, his usually calm demeanor cracked by the magnitude of the threat. Dr. Miranda Santos, Marcus's former research partner, and the woman he had loved but never found the courage to pursue, was analyzing the alien technology with desperate focus. As the scenario unfolded, Marcus learned that the Zephyrians possessed the technology to stop the invasion, but they would only intervene if humanity could provide them with someone who had completed their trials and could serve as a permanent liaison. The catch was that this role would require Marcus to undergo a transformation that would make him something between human and Zephyrian. gaining their longevity and mental capabilities, but losing his ability to form deep emotional connections with other humans. The scenario presented him with the choice in brutal detail. He could accept the transformation and save humanity, but he would spend the next several centuries watching everyone he had ever loved age and die, while being unable to form new meaningful relationships. Or he could refuse and return to Earth as himself, but humanity would face the invasion without Zephyrian assistance and billions would likely die. Marcus realized that the trial was testing not just his willingness to sacrifice, but his ability to make that sacrifice for the right reasons. The scenario was designed to reveal whether he would choose based on ego, emotion, or genuine ethical reasoning. The Zephyrians wanted to see if he could make a decision that served the greater good, even when it destroyed his personal happiness. The holographic Miranda approached him during a brief break in the crisis management. Her eyes were red from exhaustion and worry, and when she looked at him, Marcus felt the full weight of their unspoken history and unrealized possibilities. "Marcus, I know what they're asking of you," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle strength that had always attracted him to her. "I also know you well enough to know you're going to say yes because that's who you are. But I need you to understand that if you do this, we'll lose you forever. Not just me, but everyone who cares about you. Is saving us worth losing yourself?" The question cut deeper than any physical challenge Marcus had faced. The scenario was forcing him to confront the fundamental question of identity and connection that lay at the heart of human existence. What did it mean to be human if you couldn't love and be loved in return? What was the point of saving humanity if you could no longer truly belong to it? Marcus spent subjective hours in the scenario, experiencing the full weight of the decision from every angle. He watched the invasion unfold, saw the casualties mount, felt the desperation of his friends and colleagues. He also experienced simulated glimpses of what his transformed existence would be like. Centuries of isolation, watching human civilization evolve while being unable to participate in its emotional life, serving as a bridge between species while belonging fully to neither. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the trial wasn't just about his willingness to sacrifice, but about his understanding of what sacrifice truly meant. The Zephyrians weren't testing whether he would make the obvious heroic choice, but whether he could make that choice for reasons that transcended human emotional responses. They wanted to see if he could think beyond personal connections and individual identity to embrace a larger perspective on value and meaning. When Marcus finally made his decision in the scenario, accepting the transformation to save humanity, he did so not from a sense of heroic martyrdom, but from a genuine understanding that his individual happiness was less important than the continuation of human civilization. The choice was painful, but it was also clear and ethically sound from a perspective that encompassed more than just human values. The scenario dissolved, leaving Marcus back in the small chamber with Overseer Kethler. The alien's multiple eyes studied him with what might have been approval, though his expression remained unreadable. "You chose correctly," Kethler said, "but more importantly, you chose for correct reasons." The scenario was not a prediction but a test of philosophical maturity. A being who can make such decisions is capable of true leadership across species boundaries. Marcus felt emotionally drained by the intensity of the simulated experience, but also strangely clarified. The trial had forced him to examine his deepest assumptions about identity, connection, and responsibility. He had discovered that he was capable of thinking beyond purely human perspectives without losing his essential humanity. Phase 5, the integration protocol, began immediately without a rest period. Marcus found himself in a chamber that defied geometric logic, with surfaces that curved through dimensions his eyes couldn't properly process. The space felt alive in a way that was both comforting and unsettling, as if he were inside some vast organism rather than a constructed environment. Kethler's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. The final phase requires no action from you, only acceptance. You will experience temporary integration with our collective consciousness network. This will allow you to understand our perspective fully, but it will also change you in ways that cannot be reversed. Do you consent to this transformation? Marcus realized that this was the real test, the culmination of everything that had come before. The Zephyrians weren't just evaluating his capabilities. They were offering him the opportunity to become something new, a bridge between human and alien consciousness. The choice was irreversible, and he had no way of knowing what he would become on the other side of the experience. Drawing on everything he had learned during the previous phases, Marcus gave his consent. The chamber filled with harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones, and gradually his consciousness began to expand beyond the boundaries of his individual mind. He felt himself connecting to the vast network of Zephyrian thought, experiencing their collective knowledge, their ancient history, their complex understanding of the universe and their place within it. The integration was not the loss of identity that Marcus had feared, but rather an expansion of perspective that allowed him to see himself and humanity from a broader viewpoint. He understood, for the first time, why the Zephyrians structured their trials as they did. They were not testing for superiority or inferiority, but for the capacity to transcend species-specific limitations and think from a truly universal perspective. Through the collective consciousness, Marcus experienced the Zephyrian understanding of cooperation, leadership, sacrifice, and growth. He felt their genuine respect for species that could adapt and evolve beyond their original limitations, and their disappointment with those that remained trapped within narrow perspectives. The trials were not meant to prove human weakness, but to identify individuals capable of representing humanity in a larger galactic community. When the integration ended and Marcus returned to individual consciousness, he found that he retained access to insights and perspectives that would have been impossible before the experience. He was still fundamentally human, but he was also something more, someone capable of thinking and acting from a truly interspecies perspective. Overseer Kethler materialized in the chamber, and for the first time since Marcus had met him, the alien's expression was clearly readable as approval and respect. "You are the first human to complete the crucible of worth," Kethler said. "More significantly, you are the first to emerge from the integration protocol with your essential identity intact, while gaining the expanded perspective we had hoped was possible. You have proven that your species possesses the potential for true partnership rather than mere alliance. Marcus felt the weight of that achievement, but also the responsibility it entailed. He was no longer just Marcus Thompson, engineer and exchange program participant. He was proof that humans could meet Zephyrian standards and think beyond human limitations. Everything he did from this point forward would influence how the Zephyrians perceived and interacted with humanity. The return journey to the preparation sanctuary felt different than the trip that had brought him to the trial complex. The crystalline corridors no longer seemed alien and unsettling, but rather familiar and welcoming. Marcus found that he could perceive the harmonics in the architecture as more than just strange sensations. They were a form of communication, a way the Zephyrians embedded meaning and emotion into their environment. Dr. Vasquez was waiting for him in his quarters, her expression a mixture of relief, pride, and concern. She had monitored every phase of his trials and had watched him achieve something that no previous participant had managed. "How do you feel?" she asked, studying his face for signs of the psychological damage that had affected other trial survivors. Marcus considered the question carefully. He felt different, certainly, but not damaged or diminished. If anything, he felt more complete than he had before the trials began. "I feel like myself," he said finally, but with a broader understanding of what that means. The trials didn't break me down and rebuild me as something else. They helped me discover capabilities I didn't know I had and perspectives I couldn't have imagined. Dr. Vasquez nodded, but her expression remained concerned. The others who completed significant portions of the trials said similar things initially. The real test will be how well you readjust to purely human environments and relationships when you return to Earth. Marcus understood her concern, but he also knew that his experience had been fundamentally different from previous participants. The integration protocol had not just exposed him to Zephyrian perspectives, it had taught him how to bridge between different ways of thinking without losing his grounding in either one. Over the following days, as Marcus prepared for his return to Earth, he worked with Dr. Vasquez and the Zephyrian authorities to document his experiences and develop recommendations for future exchange participants. His insights would reshape how the program operated, making it less of an ordeal and more of a genuine opportunity for growth and understanding. The Zephyrians, for their part, had gained something equally valuable from Marcus's success. He had proven that humans possess the capacity for the kind of thinking that was essential for meaningful interspecies cooperation. His achievement would influence Zephyrian policy toward humanity for generations to come, opening doors to technological and cultural exchange that had previously been considered impossible. When Marcus finally boarded the transport ship that would carry him back to Earth, he carried with him not just the honor of being the first human to complete the crucible of worth, but the responsibility of representing a new kind of relationship between humanity and the broader galactic community. He had survived a trial designed to break him, but more importantly, he had emerged from it as proof that humans could grow beyond their limitations without losing what made them essentially human. The stars looked different during the journey home, not because they had changed, but because Marcus now understood his place among them in a way that few humans ever would. He was returning to Earth not as the same person who had left, but as someone who could help his species take its next evolutionary step toward true galactic citizenship. The return to Earth was more jarring than Marcus had anticipated. After months of adaptation to Zephyrian environments and perspectives, the familiar weight of terrestrial gravity felt oppressive, and the narrow spectrum of human thought patterns seemed constraining after his experience with the collective consciousness. But these were not the debilitating adjustment problems that had plagued previous trial survivors. They were simply the inevitable result of expanded awareness trying to function within more limited parameters. Marcus's first stop was the debriefing facility at the Terran Defense Initiative, where Director Patricia Hawkins and a team of specialists waited to evaluate his condition and extract every possible detail about his experiences. The facility was exactly as he remembered it, but his perception of it had changed dramatically. Where once he had seen the pinnacle of human technological achievement, he now saw the early stages of a species learning to think beyond its planetary boundaries. Director Hawkins studied him carefully as he entered the conference room, her experienced eye looking for signs of the trauma that had marked other returning participants. Instead, she found someone who moved with quiet confidence and spoke with a clarity that seemed to come from genuine understanding rather than forced adaptation. "Marcus, you look," she paused, searching for the right words, "different. Not damaged, just different. How are you handling the readjustment?" Marcus settled into his chair, noting how the simple furniture felt both familiar and crude after months of Zephyrian design. "It's like coming back to a smaller room after living in a larger space. Everything still fits, but you're aware of the limitations in a way you weren't before." The debriefing sessions stretched over several weeks, with Marcus providing detailed accounts of each trial phase while teams of psychologists, xenobiologists, and military strategists analyzed every aspect of his experience. What emerged was a picture of the Zephyrian civilization that was far more complex and nuanced than Earth's previous intelligence had suggested. The trials, Marcus explained, were not sadistic exercises in demonstrating alien superiority, but rather the Zephyrian equivalent of higher education. They were designed to identify individuals capable of thinking beyond species-specific limitations and operating effectively in the broader galactic community. The high failure rate among humans wasn't evidence of inherent inferiority, but rather of humanity's inexperience with the kind of multidimensional thinking that was commonplace among older galactic civilizations. "They're not trying to prove we're weak," Marcus told the assembled experts. "They're trying to find out if we're ready to be strong in ways we've never had to be before. The trials are an opportunity, not a punishment, but they're calibrated to their standards rather than ours." Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had returned to Earth shortly before Marcus, provided corroborating testimony about the changes she had observed in the program's approach following his success. The Zephyrians had been genuinely surprised by his completion of the trials, not because they had expected him to fail, but because they hadn't been certain that any human could achieve the kind of perspective shift that the integration protocol required. More significantly, Marcus's success had prompted the Zephyrians to reconsider their assumptions about human potential. They were now developing modified trial protocols that would be more accessible to human participants, while still maintaining the fundamental challenges that made the experience meaningful. Future exchange participants would benefit from Marcus's pioneering work, facing tests that were demanding but not impossibly calibrated to alien physiology and psychology. The real test of Marcus's transformation came when he attempted to resume his normal life and relationships. His position at the Terran Defense Initiative had been held open during his absence, but returning to his old role felt like trying to fit into clothing he had outgrown. The work that had once challenged and excited him now seemed routine, and his colleagues found his new perspectives both fascinating and slightly unsettling. The most difficult adjustment involved his personal relationships. Friends and family were relieved to have him back safely, but they quickly noticed that he was different in subtle but significant ways. He thought differently about problems, approached conflicts from angles that seemed to come from nowhere, and had a way of seeing situations from multiple perspectives simultaneously that was both impressive and occasionally alienating. His reunion with Dr. Miranda Santos, his former research partner, was particularly complex. She had followed his progress through the trials with a mixture of professional interest and personal concern, and his return stirred up all the feelings they had never quite resolved before his departure. "You're the same person," she told him during one of their first conversations after his return,